Hello students, welcome to UGC EPG Patasala. Today we are going to take up paper 1 dealing with the philosophical foundations of human rights. In that paper, the first module covers the historical development of human rights. In particular, we will be tracing the historical development of human rights from ancient times till the end of the 17th century or the Renaissance period. My name is Professor Y.S.R. Murthy. I am the Executive Director, Center for Human Rights Studies, O.P. Jindal Global University. Today, if you see, all of us have a conception of human rights. There is a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and there are a series of international covenants which have been adopted by the UN General Assembly. In other words, there is a universally recognized human rights standards or a internationally recognized human rights framework. Now, when we critically look at it, how did this human rights idea evolve over the years? In fact, every religion, every society had some notions of human rights. The way we understand human rights today have evolved over millennia through a series of struggles. In fact, a number of historical events shaped them. For instance, there are significant milestones in the evolution of human rights, starting from Ashoka Edicts to Dutch Declaration of Independence. There is a Glorious Revolution and English Bill of Rights, and then you have a French Revolution and a French Declaration of Independence, and then there is an American Declaration on the Rights of Man. So each of them is a milestone in the evolution of international human rights, and it's very important to understand the historical context of each of these events and also appreciate the significance of these milestones in the evolution of human rights. Now, students, let us look at the learning objectives for this module. Once you are through with this module, you should be in a position to understand the historical evolution of human rights. How did they evolve over the millennia, and what are the important milestones in the development of human rights till the Renaissance period or the end of the 17th century, and what is the significance of each of these milestones? Human rights refer to the rights which belong to every human being merely by virtue of his or her birth into the human family. They are universal, indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent. In fact, this idea of universally recognized human rights did not appear overnight. It is an outcome of millennia of struggles by humankind for the protection of human dignity. In the history of the world, there had been brutal, authoritarian, tyrannical regimes. There were colonial masters. There were other power holders who oppressed sections of people, who violated human rights, and there was a massive assertion of rights by the oppressed, dispossessed, marginalized sections of people, which resulted in the evolution of human rights. In fact, the concept of human rights has been influenced by several factors such as religious traditions, national laws, and philosophical writings If one looks at the evolution of human rights, one will notice that it is a product of a series of long struggles by the oppressed sections against the oppressors. In the history of the world, one will notice that there is a context of prejudice, discrimination, exploitation, oppression, colonialism, enslavement, persecution, torture, and extermination. Often, some of them followed on religious lines, gender, and other forms of persecution. Most of history is an account not of rights but rather of abuses and violations by brutal authoritarian regimes. Ancient Indian Vedic literature perhaps provides one of the first accounts of human rights. According to Vedas, a human being has a right to live, right to achieve success, right to perform good work and share the fruits of it with others, and right to perform religious rituals. He has a right to seek opportunities to live happily, divinely, and peacefully. In fact, there were notions in the ancient literature which inspired principles like universal brotherhood, peace, and justice. All of us know about dharma, how the Indian notion of dharma has governed us for several centuries. And there is this concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which literally means the whole world is one family. In other words, there ought to be universal brotherhood and peace. Though there are references to human rights at a number of places, there is one specific instance which I wish to highlight. In the Upanishads, there is an ancient Sanskrit verse which says, Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina, Sarve Santu Niramaya, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu, Ma Kaschit Dukh Bhag Bhavet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. In other words, in English, it means may all become happy, may all be free from illness, may all see what is auspicious, may no one suffer. Peace, peace, peace. In fact, the National Human Rights Commission, which was established by the Protection of Human Rights Act 1993, has adopted Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina as its motto. Right to health has been recognized as an important human right. Similarly, right to be free from violence or right to peace has also been recognized as an important human right. Right to or freedom from fear is also an extremely important human right. So, in other words, one finds multiple references to notions of human rights in the ancient Indian or Vedic literature. Cyrus Cylinder dates back to the year 539 before the Christ era. After the conquest of Babylon, Cyrus the Great issued a document giving an account of the reform which defined his rule. Till that time, the norm was that a conqueror can do anything and indulge in a series of oppressive acts against the conquered. In other words, what is called victor's justice. But Cyrus was different. Though he had the control of over 25 countries spanning 3 continents, he believed in diversity. He believed in pluralism. He had respect for different religious traditions. He had respect for different cultures, languages. In the Cyrus Cylinder, which is mentioned in the picture on the screen, there are references to freedom of religion. There are references to right to property. There are references to freedom of movement. In other words, these are all important human rights, and they find mention in the Cyrus Cylinder, which dates back to the year 539 BC era. I want to draw your attention to the picture on the screen, which is nothing but a rock edict erected by Ashoka the Great. He was chastened by the horrors of Kalinga War and other wars where millions died, and Ashoka embraced Buddhism as a result, and then he attempted to apply the principles of Buddhism in his own administration. The rock edicts include 33 inscriptions based on Buddhist philosophy. These were carved on stones in different forms and were installed at different places throughout his empire. These edicts have been regarded as instrumental in the evolution of humanitarian laws of war. In fact, what is this humanitarian laws of war? Today, there is a body of law called as international humanitarian law. Often, people, when they are asked about the origins of the international humanitarian law, look up to Battle of Solferino in 1859 and how it led Henry Dunant to establish the International Committee of Red Cross. But the fact of the matter is that there had been a lot of previous work. In fact, Ashoka edicts mention about a number of principles of international humanitarian law, and they have advocated proper treatment of the prisoners of war as well as the wounded much before the enactment of either the Geneva laws or the Hague laws or the modern or contemporary international humanitarian law. In fact, the Ashoka edicts date back to the period of 269 to 231 BC era. Students, we have covered the evolution of human rights before Christ, but before we go further, it is important to revise and recall certain concepts. Let's say, for instance, let me pose these questions. What are human rights? How did they evolve? What is the nature of contemporary international human rights framework like? And what are some important challenges to the protection of human rights? I now request you to watch the following video of about 10 minutes duration, which answers some of these questions, and it is a very powerful audio-visual tool to really understand the historical development of human rights.
Human rights is, geez, that's a good question.
Human rights.
Oh, that's a tough one.
Wow.
I don't even know how to give that a definition.
I would probably have to do a little bit of homework or something.
Any right that I think just as a normal, human,
The rights that humans have?
That's a very large debate.
Mezcla que så mange ting.
Tú le puedes preguntar a 20 personas y te van a dar 20 diferentes opiniones.
Non saprei, è una domanda complicatissima.
We just take them for granted that they're there, but we don't even consider what they are.
Human rights are the rights you have simply because you're human. It's how you instinctively expect and deserve to be treated as a person, like the right to live freely, to speak your mind, and to be treated as an equal. There are many kinds of rights. Most apply to a certain group. But human rights are the only ones that apply to absolutely everyone, everywhere. That means kids, old people, poor people, basketball players, garbage men, rappers, teachers, Africans, Indians, Albanians, Christians, Muslims, Kabbalists, atheists, your mom, your dad, your next door neighbor, and you all have the exact same human rights. In other words, they're universal. But the question remains, what are they?
Name the human rights?
What the human rights are?
the right to live.
Equality between all peoples.
Right to religion, the right to...
Is there supposed to be a list somewhere I should be aware of?
According to the United Nations, there are a total of 30 human rights, which are usually lumped together and called simply human rights. They're all listed out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the world's most widely accepted document on the subject. But it was a long time in coming. At first, there were no human rights. If you were in with the right crowd, you were safe. If you weren't, well, you weren't. But then a guy named Cyrus the Great decided to change all that. After conquering Babylon, he did something completely revolutionary. He announced that all slaves were free to go. He also said people had the freedom to choose their religion, no matter what crowd they were a part of. They documented his words on a clay tablet known as the Cyrus Cylinder. And just like that, human rights were born. The idea spread quickly to Greece, to India, and eventually to Rome. They noticed that people naturally followed certain laws, even if they weren't told to. They called this natural law, but it kept getting trampled on by those in power. Not until 1,000 years later in England did they finally get a king to agree that no one can overrule the rights of the people, not even a king. People's rights were finally recognized, and they were now safe from those in power. Kind of. It still took a bunch of British rebels declaring their independence before the king got the point that all men are created equal. Which isn't to say he liked the idea, but he couldn't stop them, and America was born. The French immediately followed with their own revolution for their own rights. Their list was even longer, and they insisted that these rights weren't just made up. They were natural. The Roman concept of natural law had become natural rights. Unfortunately, not everyone was so thrilled. In France, a general named Napoleon decided to overthrow the new French democracy and crown himself emperor of the world. He almost succeeded, but the countries of Europe joined forces and defeated him. Human rights was again a hot topic. They drew up international agreements, broadly granting many rights across Europe. But only across Europe. The rest of the world somehow still didn't qualify. Instead, they got invaded, conquered, and consumed by Europe's massive empires. But then a young lawyer from India decided enough was enough. His name was Mahatma Gandhi, and in the face of violence, he insisted that all people of Earth had rights, not just in Europe. Eventually, even Europeans started to agree. But it wasn't going to be that easy. 2 world wars erupted. Hitler exterminated half the Jewish population of Earth in horrifying Nazi death camps. And all told, 90 million people died. Never had human rights been so terrifyingly close to extinction. And never had the world been more desperate for change. So the countries of Earth banded together and formed the United Nations. Their basic purpose was to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. But what were human rights? Were they the proclamations of Cyrus, the natural laws of Rome, the declarations of France? Everyone seemed to have a slightly different idea of what human rights should be. But under the supervision of Eleanor Roosevelt, they finally agreed on a set of rights that applied to absolutely everyone. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The French concept of natural rights had finally become human rights. So, in summary, at first, only a few lucky people had any rights, until one of those guys decided, hey, other people should have some rights too, which was great, except not everyone agreed. And it only took a few thousand years of fighting and declarations and more fighting until everyone finally agreed that human rights should apply to everyone. And they all lived happily ever after. Except for one little problem. If people have the right to food and shelter, why are 16,000 children dying of starvation every day? 1 every 5 seconds. If people have freedom of speech, why are thousands in prison for speaking their minds? If people have the right to education, why are over 1 billion adults unable to read? If slavery has truly been abolished, why are 27 million people still enslaved today? More than twice as many as in 1800. The fact is, when it was signed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not have the force of law. It was optional. And despite many more documents, conventions, treaties, and laws, it's still little more than words on a page. So the question is, who will make those words a reality?
I have a dream today.
When Dr. King marched for racial equality, he was marching for rights that had been guaranteed by the United Nations for almost 2 decades. But still, he marched. When Nelson Mandela stood up for social justice in the 1990s, his country had already agreed to abolish such discrimination for almost 40 years. But still, he fought. Those who fight today against torture, poverty, and discrimination are not giants or superheroes. They're people. Kids, mothers, fathers, teachers. Free-thinking individuals who refuse to be silent. Who realize that human rights are not a history lesson. They're not words on a page. They're not speeches or commercials or PR campaigns. They are the choices we make every day as human beings. They are the responsibility we all share to respect each other, to help each other, and to protect those in need. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere.
Students, I now wish to give you the historical context or background of Magna Carta. Magna Carta is a Latin term, literally means the Great Charter. How was this signed? How did this come about? It's very important to understand it, the context. The tyrannical rule of Anglo-Saxon kings reached its climax during the reign of King John. he employed mercenaries and with their support not only taxed and fined his subjects but also performed several acts of cruelty. In fact, he was a tyrant, he oppressed his own peoples and he caused a lot of problems for his own people. In addition to that, he quarreled with the French king and also the Pope. In fact, he waged a war against them, and a war which his people didn't want. He forced his people to wage a war against both the Pope as well as the French king. His feud with Pope was a direct result of abuse of the power to confiscate the revenues of the church. In fact, this hostility escalated to the point where Pope gave the punishment of excommunication to King John. Eventually, the barons who were working under King John rebelled against him and forced him to sign the Magna Carta in the year 1215. It has an enormous significance in the evolution of international human rights law as we understand today. Forced by his barons, John signed the Magna Carta or the Great Charter in 1215. Basically, it was a peace agreement with barons on the one hand and the King John on the other. And consisting of 63 articles, Magna Carta is divided into several groups dealing with church, feudal obligations, law, justice, constitutional clauses, etc. In fact, if one looks at the articles of Magna Carta, there are references to human rights at several places. One of them says, "No man shall be taken, or outlawed, or exiled, or in any way attacked, nor will we go against him, nor send against him, unless by lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land." I want you to see the reference to the law of the land. It's extremely important. Till that point of time, there was a belief in the divine rule of kings, that king can do no wrong, and the king had an inherent right to rule for the first time, and there was a primacy given to the law of the land as against the powers exercised by the king. And the Magna Carta further provides that fines were to be proportionate to crimes. In fact, if you see the historical context, there was a excessive taxation and there were fines imposed, and what this establishes is a proportionality. Take for instance, if some people like a commoners were throwing stones at law enforcement personnel, can the law enforcement personnel return the stone throws with a bullets? It is just not possible, and it is just not done. And the response has to be proportional to the attack or the gravity of the attack. So in the same way, this proportionality principle has finds its way in the criminal law as also in the international human rights law. And one of the earliest references to this proportionality can be seen in the Magna Carta, which mentions that the fines to be imposed by the king have to be proportional to the crimes. Now, let us see the significance of the Magna Carta. In fact, Magna Carta is hailed as the first document in which the king submitted himself to what is now called quote-unquote rule of law. And it is also the first instance when a declaration clipping the powers of the king was forced on the king by the subject. Until that point of time, as I mentioned, the king had a divine right to rule, and there was a belief that king could do no wrong. And for the first time, there was a departure, and where the barons who had a running feud with the king forced a peace agreement on him, made him sign the Magna Carta, and clipped his powers in favor of the barons. Now let us see the further significance of the Magna Carta in greater detail. Magna Carta recognizes the principle that there is a body of law in the state and the rights belonging to the subjects or to the community which the king is bound to regard. If he violates them, he may be compelled by insurrection or rebellion against him to maintain it. In fact, in the 17th century, when the England witnessed a constitutional struggle between the king on the one hand and the parliament on the other over who is more powerful, who is sovereign, and the parliament of England carried on this struggle in the name of Magna Carta. It invoked the provisions of the Magna Carta, the promise of the Magna Carta, the objectives of the Magna Carta, and carried on the struggle. And we will see in greater detail the English Bill of Rights in the further down. In fact, the Magna Carta also influenced the American Declaration of Independence. If one looks at European history, Magna Carta can be regarded as the first written constitution. Dutch people were under the colonial rule of Spain. They were oppressed. They didn't have a self-rule. They were taxed, and their human rights were not respected. Eventually, they rebelled against the oppression of the colonial rule, and they gave to themselves Dutch Declaration of Independence in the year 1581. It is an important milestone in the evolution of human rights because several rights, particularly right to rule or govern themselves, have been mentioned in the Dutch Declaration of Independence. Oliver Thatcher, commenting on the significance of the Dutch Declaration of Independence, said, I quote, "The Declaration, the first in modern times, brings forward prominently the great idea that rulers are responsible to the people and can be deposed by them. The growth of this idea is center of the development of constitutional and republican government." If one looks at the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one finds an echo of this in the preamble to the UDHR. It's very clearly mentioned that rights, peace, and justice are inextricably linked and that they have to be protected unless mankind is not forced to remove the authoritarian or the regime which is not protecting human rights. In the 17th century, the tyrannical rule of King James led to glorious revolution. There are a series of religious and political factors which led to the glorious revolution and the subsequent adoption of the English Bill of Rights. Protestant Christians, who became a numerical majority at that point of time, became very uncomfortable with the patronage of the state extended to the Catholics, and spurred by the development of democratic traditions and ideals of democracy, there was dissatisfaction amongst the masses in the rule of James II. The Glorious Revolution was a result of an attempt by a group of English lords to overthrow King James II from the throne. As we have seen, he oppressed his own peoples. The objective behind the revolution was to establish the supremacy of the parliament over the monarchy. The purpose of the revolution was realized when the new monarchs accepted the Declaration of Rights along with the throne. The Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights have a great significance in the historical development of human rights. The English Bill of Rights was signed into law in 1689, and it established the rule of constitutional monarchy in England, which guaranteed individual rights to its citizens. It's at this stage, it's very important to understand that till that point of time, the monarch was regarded as a supreme and who could do no wrong and who had a divine right to rule. For the first time, you find a transition from a constitutional or an absolute monarch to a constitutional monarchy which guaranteed individual rights to citizens. While it was called the Bill of Rights, the primary focus of this document was to define the relationship between the parliament on the one hand and the monarchy on the other hand, rather than elaborate on the issue of individual rights. However, it became a great source of inspiration for the spread of parliamentary form of democracy throughout the world. So students, let us review what we have learned in this module. To sum up, we have seen the human rights notions right from the Vedic period and downwards, and how before Christ era there were important milestones in the development of human rights. And similarly, we saw the Magna Carta and its significance, and we also examined the Dutch Declaration of Independence, and we have seen the English Bill of Rights and the Glorious Revolution. And it's very important to understand these milestones. In fact, each of these milestones preceded or followed, I beg your pardon, each of these milestones, behind them was a cumulative factors, both religious, political, and history of, let's say, oppression or colonialism or traditional, hierarchical and brutal authoritarian regimes which suppressed human rights. And in fact, there were series of struggles to further assert human rights, and that's how there were repeated affirmations of rights across the millennia, and which eventually culminated in the human rights as we understand today. In fact, if one looks at the concept of human rights as mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or as defined in the human rights covenants in the contemporary international human rights law, these are not, let's say, isolated things. These need to be seen from the perspective of a historical evolution over millennia. In fact, they are a product of a series of struggle to affirm the importance of human dignity.